so cold.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Lori Jakes, and I am the Associate Vice President for Alumni Relations and Annual Giving here at Northeastern. It's great to see so many alumni, students, colleagues, friends who are here with us for this critical conversation. Personally, I'm very excited to hear from our distinguished panel and to learn more about women's health. And I have no doubt that when you leave here, you will walk away with something that you didn't know before. Right now, you're a part of a vast and dynamic community of almost 360,000 alumni. So it's pretty significant. And I hope that during this time tonight so far, you've had the opportunity to connect with someone new. If you haven't, please make sure that you leave tonight doing so, because it's really just so important. You don't know how that person is going to be able to help you or how their network can help you. So I strongly encourage you to do that before you leave this evening. And with that in mind, I do want to acknowledge a couple of individuals who are here and who are a part of our network, starting with Dr. Carmen Skepa, who's the Dean of the Bouvet College of Health Sciences, who's here with us this evening. My colleague, Jennifer Barrymore, who is the Vice President for Advancement Resources. Jennifer also serves she also is the founder of the Village of Belonging. If you haven't had an opportunity to learn what that is, there's a table outside. Please stop by that as you leave tonight, and you can learn a little bit more about that. And I also want to acknowledge one of our Young Alumni Advisory Board members who is here, Liz Woodwell, who's our Vice Chair. So Liz, thanks for being here. But the hard part when you start to name people is that there's people, I could probably name everyone in the room, but there's a lot of my colleagues who are here. We have some faculty members here, so please make sure before you leave tonight you find an opportunity to connect with them. But now we will move on to the main event. And I'd like to introduce, as I said, I acknowledge Sue, but I want to formally introduce Sue, who is a graduate of Mills College, a California attorney who left a career in government and moved to Vietnam 31 years ago. She made a pivot to biotech nearly 20 years ago. She is the CEO and founder of Alton Biosciences, a company pursuing a novel patented investigational drug for uterine fibroids. And we are so happy to have her here because the topic of women's health needs all of our attention. Sue.
Well, I have to thank Lori and her staff. As she said, we only met 3 weeks ago. So I'm grateful to Northeastern, to the Mills Institute, and to the Women's Empowerment Group for pulling this together tonight. My colleagues on the panel and I have been for the last 2 days at a Women's Health Horizon conference here in Boston, so it was very fortuitous. So I'm going to turn it over now to our moderator, Cheryl Kerr, and we will each introduce ourselves.
Perfect. Thank you, Sue. It is really exciting for us to be here. Like Sue said, we just came from a conference, which was fantastic. There's so much to talk about when it comes to women's health care, whether it's diseases that impact women differently, like heart attacks, or whether it's diseases that disproportionately impact women, like autoimmune diseases. We also see a lot more Alzheimer's in women than we do in men. So we talked all about those topics, as well as diseases that specifically impact women, right? So mostly the gynecologic diseases like fibroids, endometriosis, PCOS. Additionally, we got to learn all sorts of new things about osteoporosis. I don't know about you all, but I was pretty impressed by that talk. And even eye health being related to hormones. So it's fascinating, and I think one of the key takeaways for me was how we really have to take an integrated approach to care. We can't just think about who's the doctor we're seeing today, whether it's an orthopedic or an ophthalmologist. We need to take our whole health history into account, and we need to advocate for our own health care, because not that it's their fault, but physicians are trained in specific specialties, and it's up to us to know our bodies and know what to ask for. So that was one of my key takeaways. But I do want to introduce myself. I'm Cheryl Kerr. I come from 30 years in big pharma and med device. I recently left that area to come work with startups. I just found that as much as I really enjoyed my career in pharma, and I was able to be a part of some really exciting things across different disease states like neurology, cardiovascular health, anticoagulation, my love and my true passion is women's health. And that's because one of the things you're going to see as we talk a little bit more about it is there are some serious gaps. There are gaps in research because women are complicated. Women have hormones that can mess with clinical trials. How dare they? We see gaps in funding. Women get a very minute portion of the overall venture capital investment, and that's because most investors are men, and you can't blame them. They don't know what the hell we're talking about when we start talking about our bodies and these crazy things that happen every month. And as a result, we're really behind, right? So we're trying to make decisions based on very limited data sets. However, I am going to say we're all here very optimistic for the future because things are starting to shift. People are standing up and taking notice that investing in women's health isn't just a good cause or the right thing to do or a niche opportunity. It is a huge investment opportunity, and it has big consequences for the economy. So with that, I would like to turn it over to my colleagues to introduce themselves as well. Shelley, also known as the Boston Connector.
Hi, I'm Shelley Amster, and because of the audience, I want to make sure that I tell you my story so that you can see that when a door opens, take the opportunity. I went to undergrad as a medical technologist and never got to finish the PhD when I got asked to set up a lab in the Department of OBGYN in 1978. So now you get to know how old I am. I didn't know what the word trailblazer, entrepreneur, innovator was, but I was working for the chairman of OBGYN that was working on the first laparoscope. We had the first preterm clinic in Connecticut, and we were videotaping fetal development in first and second trimester before the abortion took place. It got into Look magazine. He was doing transsexual surgeries back in '78 on men and women. I was doing lung maturation on, on pregnant women, so we knew that the babies were ready to be born or needed to be born. I did blood work on the neonatal unit so that those babies had enough blood to have testing. And 2 years into that, we hired the first reproductive endocrinologist from the fellowship program at Harvard to set up a reproductive arm, which today is more like infertility. And I got to learn about sperm, from semen analysis to sperm washing to freezing, and all the tests that show how sperm have the ability to fertilize an egg. And I was on the first Pergonal study when that was the drug from Serono that was going to revolutionize ovulation induction. Steptoe and Edwards was working on IVF in the UK, and baby Brown was born, and they went on the speaking engagement in Connecticut, and I got invited to meet them. We were already talking about IVF, but when Dr. Alan DeTurney from Yale, who was division chair, stood up and said, "I'm setting up a program and I need a lab director," I was devastated in my mind that I didn't finish the PhD. And I went home to my new husband and said, oh my God, I wish I'd finished, I could have an opportunity. He forced me to make that call. I got hired on the spot. It changed my life forever. That world has been a part of me my whole journey. And what I wanted to tell you, when she mentioned networking, nurture every person that walks into your life. You never know when you need them. I can still call Dr. DeTurney up. He retired a few years ago as emeritus from NIH, head of reproductive endocrinology. And from Yale, I moved to Tufts. And he had actually got me a job at at Harvard and Tufts. I turned down Harvard because the division chair had trained in my lab, and I wanted to put him on the map. And I got to work with the researcher who identified gap junctions. And I learned so much about embryology, even more. And then I got lured into industry to help commercialize it. I'd like to just fast forward that I have 5 products that I help identify around the world that are now in the Cooper Surgical portfolio. And all I can tell you is every one of those things were because the network pays off, and don't give it up. And to fast forward to now, I did diligence on a technology out of UMass, and I launched a company called 3 Daughters 5 or 6 years ago, and we're on hold mode right now, and I'm sitting on boards, but everything is possible.
Well done. Thank you, Shelley. This woman has an incredible track record, and we just came from a conference where she's like Madonna. She doesn't need a last name. Everybody just says Shelley. Carries a lot of weight. Yes, absolutely. Buchitra, we'd love to hear about you and your background.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you this evening. I'm Buchitra. I'm a physician by training and a researcher by profession. I have not worked for that long to have such an illustrious career, but currently I'm the Director of Clinical Research at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. I'm also a Clarendon Research Fellow at the University of Oxford. My research interests are bucketed into 4 different categories. The first thing that I do day in and day out is translational clinical trials. So we have clinical trials in all phases of drug development, 0 through 4, and we do that day in and day out. We recruit, we do the interventions, we track the patients, and we see what's happening. They're both, sometimes they're NIH funded, the other times they're pharmaceutical funded studies. The second part of that is we try to understand the etiopathology of these benign gynecologic conditions. Our lab within the Division of Reproductive Sciences is very much focused on the benign side of gynecology, and then there is the oncology side, which is not something that I do. So please don't ask me about that. So we try to understand why are some women experiencing these extreme symptoms with fibroids, with endometriosis, the gamut of expression of PCOS, and so on and so forth. My love in basic sciences recently has been looking at somatic cancer driver mutations in endometriotic lesions to understand whether that is a particular etiopathological pathway that may be playing a role in endometriosis.
Can we pause there for 1 second?
Yes.
Can you say that in a layperson's term?
Oh, yes, of course. So there are various ways a person could have endometriosis. One of the prevailing theories is retrograde menstruation. So there is backward flow of blood. Instead of going out through the cervix, the blood is going backwards through the fallopian tubes into the abdominal and peritoneal cavity. And it's not an absolutely closed system, so there's always some effluent going either ways. But in certain subset of populations that develop endometriosis, there are factors that make it consistently happening and providing it a nidus for growth and invasion and things that make it endometriosis. So one of the potential theories is that the somatic cancer driver mutations, they give this potential to these endometriotic cells to invade and then have food and air and oxygen to survive in this situation, which is ectopic for them. I hope that was better.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're getting there.
Sorry, my last few months I've just been in a dark room cutting, with a laser endometriotic tissue. So my human skills have definitely gone down. Then the other love that I have in basic sciences is I'm looking at biomarkers for human eggs, because in IVF, you superovulate, you superstimulate the ovaries to have multiple follicles get engaged in a cycle so that you can collect more eggs and the person doesn't have to go multiple cycles to get a baseline oocyte. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify, without disturbing the egg, some biomarkers that do correlate with the quality. That is all I can talk about that one. Then I do a lot of research in public health, which is another love of mine. And we like to take a 360-degree view of attacking gynecologic conditions, because we found that if we just take one route, it becomes very difficult to have a well-rounded proposition for people to actually see change happen. So in terms of public health research, we focus on access to all of these wonderful therapies that are already in the market. What are the barriers? What are the bottlenecks? My particular research focuses on access to period products. And you are the first people to know. We just finished a paper where we found that the taxation on period products is exceedingly high in the southern region of the United States compared to all the other 3 regions of the United States. And counties that had more than 50% minority populations were also paying more tax on the period products, which should be items of basic necessity from where I see it. And then there's also distribution in the states that have a mandate to cover for the cost of period products in schools. So the states that did have a mandate and provided funding attached to that mandate had a lower taxation rate on period products. I mean, guess right. And the states that did not, they had a higher taxation of period products. And the last bucket, and then I will shut up about my research.
You have a lot of interest, Chitra.
Healthcare management research. And that is just to tell you that I use every single degree that I have after my name. All right. So with the healthcare management research, no. We try to look at ways to improve efficiency in a basic science research lab. We've all set up some kind of experiment, right? Either a social experiment or a basic sciences experiment. There are always ways to improve the efficiency of getting to the outcome faster, but in a scientifically valid fashion. So that is a set of experiments that we do in order to improve the efficiency of those processes. And the last thing that I do in that bucket is develop efficiency markers for IVF clinics, because it is a time of a lot of psychological burden in terms of a person going through fertility care, in addition to the economic burden. So if we can make that experience a little bit better for people going through that process, that is the aim we're trying to do, and identify markers that can actually associate with better experience in an IVF clinic. Those are all the things that I've been interested in recently.
I feel like a total slacker compared to you. Well, one of the areas that we wanted to make sure we covered, and I think it's a really good way to describe women's healthcare in terms of, we know about the gaps, right? We talked about it, the lack of research, et cetera. But that means there are so many opportunities. And thinking back to this conference that we just came from, it all starts with awareness. As women, we often don't talk about our bodies. We don't talk about our periods. We don't talk about the pain that may be associated with them, the fact that we're bleeding through our clothes. And it's critical that if we're going to have real conversations and try to make a difference in some of these disease states, that we're more open about it, and we're talking with it, and we're having open dialogue with our physicians. So one of the key areas is awareness, and I know that was described in the description of the program. We need to increase it, and we need to increase education so that when women do show up in front of their doctor, they're having an informed conversation, and they're making the most out of that 5-10 minutes they get in front of that physician.
And you're going to let me tell the frog story, right?
You're telling the frog story. Okay. Go, Sue.
Okay. So one of the problems is our own health literacy about our own bodies. There's an organization, period.com, that did a survey a couple of years ago and wrote a white paper surveying girls graduating from high school. Something like 76% of them said they knew more about the biology of a frog than they did about their own bodies. So that needs to be addressed at even younger. Huh? Now you know what the frog story. I promised you the frog story. So that needs to be addressed at even younger than high school level. And this is not sex ed, this is biology.
Yeah, basic
So that
anatomy.
how can you know what is abnormal bleeding if you don't know what normal bleeding is? And normal bleeding is not very much. But if girls are having painful and prolonged and heavy periods, and they talk to their mother, their aunt, their sister, and the mother or aunt or sister says, oh, I had the same thing, you know, it just runs in our family. Well, it's not. It's not. The other thing is in being our own advocates with our healthcare providers. There was a study done. Do you know how long, well, your average doctor appointment is, what, 7 minutes, something like that. They did a study of how long the patient talks to the doctor before the doctor interrupts the patient. Any guess? 11 seconds. So, and they just want to jump to writing you a prescription, and they don't have time to hear all of this.
So true. And that's what leads us to a lot of issues like delayed diagnoses, lack of treatment. And when we get to Sue, she's going to share with us a good solution for a number of those areas. When we think about awareness, I want to ask this of the panel. We have other areas that we talk about where there's gaps that we're trying to bridge, right? Balancing clinical studies. Puchitra, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Until very recently, 3 decades ago, there was not enough female representation in clinical trials. In recent times, I don't know if you may remember this from the news, you know, the dose of Xanax, one of the more commonly prescribed drugs, it's alprazolam. And so initially, it was prescribed at the same dose for both males and females. And clearly, it was efficacious, it was safe. But when there was sub-analysis done for the dosage required of the drug between a male and a female for the same level of efficacy, the dose in female is half of what was being prescribed. So now there is, of course, more awareness about it, so the doses have been fixed. But there's so much that we don't understand about the sex-based differentiation in terms of physiology and clearly pathophysiology as well. So for my clinical trials, of course, it's not an issue, and I think we were joking about this before. Yes, so for all of the clinical trials that we do, they are genotypically female, versus a number of other chronic conditions such as diabetes, hypertension, somebody going through knee replacement. There has to be good amount of representation of both sexes so that you can understand if the experiences are the same. If there's a delta, where is that delta from? Where is the difference coming from? Is it something which is sex-based, or is it based on any other interventions that were done as part of care? And unfortunately, still, a lot of clinical trials don't have parity in terms of equal representation of female and male. So that is just a request I have. You know, when you're designing your clinical trials and enrolling patients into the clinical trial, make a concerted effort that there is good representation of all types of people, so that when we are generalizing and extrapolating from that information, it looks like the population that we live in. And given, I'll use your number, 51% is clearly not the minority. So there is a need for better understanding of the sex-based difference in treatment and clinical trials.
Let me just add a quick note that I think we need to make sure. Diversity is also important, because there's a big difference between the Black population, the obese population, and all the different body types, as well as ethnic groups and different minorities. So we need to make sure that the trials have a cross-section of populations.
Yeah.
What Lori may remember me from saying at Mills was, wake up! Women are not small men. We are differentiated at the cellular level from men. And companies were discouraged from including women in clinical trials, and it wasn't until 1993 that legislation came into effect saying you need to include the women. So the drugs Buchitra is talking about were developed on studies performed on men, so it should be no surprise that the dosages are different for women, and the incidence of serious adverse events and mortality for women from these drugs is much higher than men.
Thank you for waking us all up, Sue.
Yes, I'm definitely.
I don't think I need my alarm.
And in the racial and ethnic disparities, I only learned a few years ago, getting into this, that under a microscope, if you're looking at uterine fibroid cells, Buchitra can tell the difference from the fibroid cells from a black woman versus the fibroid cells from a white woman. It manifests differently.
Of course, it's within a standard deviation. Yes. So not all fibroids are created equally. There are different types of fibroid histopathologically. And this is a concern of mine, especially with the disease that we're interested in, uterine fibroids. Every time I would present something at a conference, and these are people who are interested in uterine fibroids and they want to develop interventions and better understand the disease, there would be somebody standing up and saying, oh, it's a fibroid, is a fibroid, is a fibroid. And I'm like, just because we don't understand and classify a disease well enough does not make it a homogeneous disease.
Yes.
It's a poor work on our part, not on the part of the patient.
Went to you. No, I couldn't agree more, Buchitra. These are critical points, and I think it's leading us right to Sue's talk.
Fibroids?
About Alton. We're already on the subject of fibroids because we're obsessed with them. So we're going to ask Sue to share with us what she's been working on, and we can make sure to touch on the investment side of things later in the conversation.
So I'm going to move here because I want to show you some slides. I'm working under a little-known regulatory pathway under the FDA called botanical drug, where a plant-based product can get FDA drug approval. These are not supplements, these are drugs. And the FDA has a whole body of regulation called Botanical Drug Guidance for Industry. I can send you a copy for anybody that's interested. And since that legislation came into effect, several have been approved. There are now more than 1,000 in the pipeline. Most of those are academic and will never rise to the level of commercialization. But I became involved in this after I'd moved to Vietnam and learned about the wealth of botanical diversity in Vietnam and the number. The ministry has classified 4,000 to 5,000 botanicals in Vietnam as being medicinal. And I happened to get introduced to one of them. So Alton Biosciences was formed to exploit this tremendous opportunity. Fibroids impact up to 80% of women by the age of 50. 30 to 50% of women will be symptomatic with symptoms of pain, heavy bleeding, and pressure, pelvic pain. About 50% of women may not exhibit symptoms and may not learn they have fibroids until they try to get pregnant and they're having issues with infertility, and one of the things the doctor will do is, let's do a scan. Oh, look, you have fibroids. Fibroids can essentially act like an IUD preventing conception. They can also be stimulated to grow with the estrogen that happens during pregnancy, and they can cause a spontaneous abortion. They can basically kill the fetus, and they contribute to postpartum hemorrhaging, which can kill the mother. So they disproportionately impact women of color. There's a recent study by Dr. Susanna Mitro out of Kaiser in Northern California where they looked at nearly 2 million women diagnosed with fibroids. It validated our knowledge of a higher incidence in Black women, but it also broke down more with Asian and Hispanic and different populations of South Asian, East Asian women. Buchitra did the study that quantified The burden on, this is the US economy alone, it costs us over $42 billion a year for fibroids, about half of that being medical costs, surgeries and drugs, and about half of that being the societal cost. Lost women's labor hours, lost professional advancement, lost education, lost quality of time with the family. There they are. So fibroids can be as small as a grain of rice or as big as a 65-pound pumpkin. A woman can have one or she can have dozens. When the uterus is not pregnant, it's 1 by 2 by 3 inches. When it's pregnant, it's receiving messages to expand to accommodate the fetus. When it's not pregnant, it does not want to expand. That's why when you have something growing in there, it can be so painful. So for the men, imagine any of these golf or tennis or grapefruit-sized things growing in your arm muscle or your calf muscle. Very painful. So they're the #1 reason for women to have a hysterectomy is because of fibroids. And we'll get into more of the treatments later. What I learned from Vietnam was that there was a doctor working with a particular variety of Crinum latifolium that works to shrink fibroids. And another body of research in the US on epigallocatechin gallate, EGCG, green tea, that has also been clinically studied to treat uterine fibroids. And Buchitra is involved in some of that research as well. And what I did was combine these two formulations that each individually have clinical data for uterine fibroids, combining them in such a way that that could be patented. We reached synergy in the combination. So under patent law, you can't patent a natural product on its own. But if you can combine them in a way that's not obvious, so if the Crinum shrinks fibroids and the EGCG shrinks fibroids, it's kind of logical that if you put them together, they might work better. So hypothetically, if this one has a 25% impact on fibroids and this one has a 20% impact on fibroids, in order to meet the US Patent Office definition of synergy, you have to show that substantially more than 45% efficacy against fibroids. And that's what we did at several dosage levels, and that patent came through a couple months ago. So, yeah. So, under, again, the botanical drug regulation, if the FDA is satisfied about the safety of those two botanical components of our drug, they may allow us to accelerate directly to a phase 2A study. I think most people know that FDA regulations require a phase 1 study for safety. Phase 2 starts to get into efficacy. Phase 3, a much bigger population for efficacy. So since there's almost 22,000 studies on EGCG, the FDA accepts the safety of EGCG in the very small dosages that we need to accelerate the impact of the Crinum. These are studies on the Crinum latifolium. The two on the left were done by the Ministry of Health of Vietnam, one specifically for uterine fibroids and another for benign prostatic hyperplasia, prostate enlargement in men. And then my company sponsored 2 more studies on the Crinum ingredient, one for menopause, where we found that 93% of the women in the study had statistically significant benefit from this herb. And then we also did a study on the prostate health for the men. And what I got so excited when I saw these results was that 88% in a small study, it was during COVID, we got 49 men, but it's validated the 89% in the larger study by the Vietnamese ministry. 88, 89, that was pretty exciting. I did research. One of the pressing questions was, this Vietnamese Crinum acts like an estrogen. It's delivering what we perceive to be the benefits of estrogen, but the doctor in Vietnam felt it was not a phytoestrogen. And UIC, the University of Illinois Chicago, was the place where I could go where they developed bioassays to test plant estrogens, and they found indeed that it is not a plant-based estrogen. It stimulates no known estrogen receptors in the body. So it is safe for women, for example, who have had breast cancer and are maybe taking tamoxifen and have to avoid excess estrogen. This is safe for them to take. Because of UIC's positive results in the research, they introduced me to Dr. Ayman Al-Hindi, who is one of the key opinion leaders, together with Buchitra, on uterine fibroids in women. And Ayman has been the principal investigator or co-principal on most every drug researched for uterine fibroids. Some have been approved, some not approved, but he's the guy. And he was the one spearheading the research on EGCG for uterine fibroids. And the first time I met him in person, I said, you have this great safety and efficacy phase 2 data. They're now in phase 3 for EGCG. Why aren't you bringing this to market for women? And he said, Sue, there's no IP around green tea. No company will invest the money to bring a drug to market if Procter & Gamble can come out with the same thing the next day. There's no IP, there's no protection. They'll never do it just because it will benefit millions of women. So the fact that we've now been able to patent this is our path to commercialization. For the science nerds, this research has been published. I sent my formulations for these combinations to Dr. Al-Hindi at the University of Chicago, where he tested them on human uterine fibroid cell lines. And we found the synergy at several different dosage levels. This research is published, and I'm happy to give you a link to it. So this is kind of us versus them. The gold standard of care treatment for fibroids is still a hysterectomy, because that is the only treatment where the fibroids won't recur, because you don't have a uterus anymore. Hysterectomy has become a conventional surgery. I forgot to give the disclaimer at the very beginning. Everything we're saying here is our own personal opinions. This is not medical advice, and you should never rely on anything any of us say. You should seek professional opinion from your healthcare provider. So, my opinion is that hysterectomy has become a conventional surgery, and it shouldn't be. Cancer, different story. But for these other conditions, women need better alternatives, and the more recent research is finding that there is a uterus-brain connection that is little understood and little appreciated. Mayo Clinic, Arizona State have done research, and equalizing for all other health conditions, if a woman has had the hysterectomy, there is an 8% higher incidence of early onset dementia. Let that sink in. We need better options. The other drugs are all GnRH agonists, antagonists. They all work by chemically inducing menopause, chemically suppressing ovulation. So if the reason you're trying to shrink your fibroids is so you can get pregnant and have a baby, and you take a drug that makes that impossible, it's not a good solution. And the FDA will not allow those drugs to be taken for longer than 2 years because of the toxicity. And at the end of 1 year, 20% of the women will have irreversible osteoporosis. That's just one of 33 different contraindications and side effects that I counted in the package insert. And then there's us. So we're pretty happy. We need to move forward now with the clinical studies. For that, we need funding. So this is a patented, de-risked potential solution for a health condition that is an enormous economic burden for the U.S. Both of these botanicals have had centuries of safe use in humans, qualify for FDA fast track, and we're looking at a very nice return. As Cheryl can say, you didn't say that you were 30. Can I mention the company?
Sure.
Well, yeah, it's on.
Sure.
She was 30 years with Bayer. And Bayer was working on, Dr. El-Hindi was the principal investigator on villapreson, Bayer's attempt at a uterine fibroid drug that they abandoned in phase 3 studies because they couldn't overcome the toxicity, but not before Bayer had forecast, and this was coming up on 10 years ago, that their annual sales would be over $1 billion a year. I'm happy to give you links to any of the research that I've cited. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. I think this is a great point to pause and ask for questions, especially with all that excellent information you just shared. Any questions from the group here related? It doesn't have to be specific to fibroids.
And don't be intimidated. Please speak up.
Because if you don't have questions, Shelley will.
Yes, please.
Wait for microphone.
I did theater. I can project.
Yeah, you can.
Oh, yes, that makes sense. I'm just curious about the botanicals. You mentioned centuries of safe use. Was any of that related to any cultural practices?
Fascinating that you asked that.
Okay,
Sue's
so
got some cool stories.
The Vietnamese one, Crinum latifolium, there are a dozen different subspecies of Crinum. You would look at the lily and you'd say, oh, it's right over there. Yes, but no. There are some that are toxic, some that are benign. The one that had the medicinal effect was so rare in the wild that the kings of Vietnam made it secret. It was called, alternatively, the king's herb, because it shrinks the prostate in men, or the royal women's herb, because it kept the concubines fertile, making babies for the king. And it was forbidden to be written up in the monographs of traditional medicine. It was kept a secret until the last king abdicated and fled communism, fled to France in 1954. And then our doctor in Vietnam, who got her PhD in Europe and wanted to study, connect folklore with fact, apply modern scientists to folkloric medicine and prove what works and why. She came across it in 1990 and brought it forth from there, identified the toxic ones, the benign ones, said, I think this is the one, took it out of the wild, propagated it, and now we have close to 30 years of batch to batch to batch consistency in the extraction. And that's usually one of the problems with the FDA and botanicals, because the extraction from that acre over there on the plantation compared to that acre over there on the plantation can be different. And you've got to be able to standardize it and be consistent. And that's been achieved.
Thank you.
Yes, I see another question in the back.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I have a question about, you mentioned there's a higher incidence of fibroids in Black women. Do you have any idea of why that may be? Is it social or is it biological? What's the root cause of that higher incidence?
That is a very good question, and something that we're trying to investigate ourselves as well. But we do know that the uterine microenvironment is more stiff in Black women compared to white women, because that was the comparator group in the study. And when there's a stiffer environment, the fibroid cells like to grow more for some reason, which we understand there's mechanotransduction pathways that get really hyperstimulated in those situations. So that could be one of the reasons why it's different. And magically or not magically, when you're actually enrolling for these studies for fibroids, every single time we've done these studies, the ratio almost is 2:1. Whether our sample size was 15, or it was 20, or it was 178. it automatically comes to a point where it mimics this kind of 2:1 kind of ratio between black versus white women. And we're in Baltimore, so our patient population is heavily black and African American. So it is interesting that it always comes to almost the same proportion. But we do believe that it is biologic, because if you do control for all the other factors, it still remains to be the case. Also, in black women, the symptoms start early. So the curve of growth for fibroids begins between 20 to 25 years in black women, and for white women, it's between 25 to 30 years. In addition, the fibroids usually are bigger and stiffer, and the symptoms are worse for black women compared to white women. So it's just a lot of epidemiological data that suggests that there is some differentiation in the type of fibroids we're seeing between the two races.
I think this is a good time to add to it also. Black women from poorer neighborhoods are getting less care as well, and so they're ignored by qualified practitioners. And so being ignored longer makes it even a more complicated situation.
And the World Health Organization says if a girl misses 4 days a month of school because of her period, she loses 10 to 20% of her overall education. How can you possibly excel if you can't be in the classroom and get the knowledge? And yet, if you're in pain, personally, I think it's really hard to concentrate on learning or doing your homework or doing your job if you're in pain. Especially if you're being told that pain's all in your head, because it's not.
I think it's also important to point out the other key symptom with fibroids, and that is heavy periods. And they are no joke. We see women showing up at the emergency room needing blood transfusions. Anemia post-period is extremely common. So I think we really need to take notice for women and young girls when they have heavy periods. What are the other impacts of that? And what is the cause, right? Trying to get to it. The good thing about fibroids, right, we're trying to be optimistic, is they're relatively easy to diagnose, right? You can get an ultrasound and you can typically see them.
Unlike endometriosis.
Which requires a surgical diagnosis, which makes me crazy. So they're not hard to find. It's a matter of getting a physician's attention. It's a matter of, again, advocating for yourself that you know your periods aren't normal, even if other people tell you they are, and insisting on a diagnostic test such as an ultrasound so that you at least know what you're dealing with.
So one of our colleagues who couldn't be here tonight is Carol Johnson. She's the CEO of a company called Uterine Kind. UterineKind.com. There is a free app that you can download that will allow you to enter your daily symptoms so that over a period of time, when you finally get your 11 seconds with your doctor, it'll download the data in such a way that a medical practitioner is accustomed to seeing it and may say, oh, you might have fibroids, let's do a scan. Because we've postulated that one of the reasons they don't get diagnosed is because, other than a hysterectomy or questionable drugs, the doctors don't have a solution. So whether it's conscious or unconscious, they don't reach that point. The recent case of Venus Williams, where it took 20 years for her to get a diagnosis. You talked about
my endometriosis diagnosis was 22 years. Yeah.
And being on the floor of the hotel, curled up in pain before you had to go in and present at board meetings?
Yeah, I just put 2 and 2 together actually today because I was a last minute add to an endometriosis panel. And a shout out to our buddy Mark over here who has a therapeutic in development for endo. But unlike fibroids, which are 80% of the female population, endo is about 10%. But again, underdiagnosed. As women, we tend to just suck it up and deal with it, right? That's what we're taught from when we first get our periods all the way through. So you don't realize how severe your symptoms are, but I was facing moments of not only the heavy periods of bleeding through the clothes, but extreme pain to the point where it would induce vomiting. And I would be at occasions like this, right, as a young professional, marketing executive, speaking in front of our sales force and being all rah-rah about our marketing plan. 5 minutes earlier, I'm in my hotel, writhing on the bathroom floor in extreme pain. And I just realized today, I'm like, what is that drug I used to take? It was an opioid. I didn't even know it. The pain was that severe. That was the only thing that would touch it. So again, when we compare and contrast fibroids to endo, they both have some similar symptoms and the heavy periods and the pain. But the good thing about fibroids is we can diagnose them without surgery. And when we think about the optimism of the future that we all share, we've come from a dark place in women's health. We've come from decades of neglect in terms of research and advancement. But really the time is now that people are starting to stand up and take notice. And again, it's not just out of the kindness of our hearts. That story is good for a lot of us that feel this connection to women's health, but investors are recognizing that there is a huge economic benefit to having women performing at optimal levels. And that's why we're starting to see some movement and interest. We even have venture capital groups that are starting now that are specifically focused on women founders and investing in disease states that disproportionately impact women. So we're making progress, and I couldn't be more excited about what Sue has going and some of the other endometriosis solutions that are coming.
Can I pipe in a minute before you do, Sue?
Yeah.
So I went to college before women had the rights that you do, so before Title IX. And I was at my 50th reunion when we never thought that Roe was going to turn again. And a lot of us were very disappointed and upset. But I want to say, I think that was the deciding moment that stirred this next rise of recognition of the importance of women's rights and the knowledge around health care for women. So I want to think that when we were just thinking about this, that it was actually, thank you very much for turning it, because now's the moment that we got our voice, and I think despite it all, we're going to get through this.
I want to hit, again, just expand a little bit on the importance of getting a diagnosis. Our colleague, Soteria Venable, was at the conference today. She is a Black woman who founded the Fibroid Foundation. Oh, yeah. And Soteria had overall 7 surgeries for fibroids over the years. I have a friend that had 2 surgeries, and in those 2, they removed 47 fibroids in those 2 surgeries. But getting the diagnosis so that you know that you have fibroids, you can make lifestyle changes that can impact that. What she told us today that was after her surgeries were about 7 months apart, a year apart, and after she became a pescatarian and stopped eating red meat, she went 7 years before another surgery.
And I just want to add a caveat that a case report is a case report, and you should wait for an observational study with a larger sample size to make an association which is more valid.
And none of this is medical advice.
I think it was the red meat?
Yes,
red
I see.
meat, different. Fish, pescatarian diet, different. So there are studies on the other and versus pescatarian food. So it is, I would implore you to empower yourself to participate in clinical trials, because so many times one of the primary reasons why clinical trials fail is because of recruitment.
Yes.
There are not enough people who want to participate in the study. And jokingly, I was talking to an Asian female this morning, and it was like, but in every single clinical trial that I have, there's maybe 1 Asian female. What's with the disproportionate number of Asian people participating in clinical trial? And it could be that the disease prevalence is low in that population, or it could be that people are not participating in the clinical trial. And my 2 cents of request is, please, if you see a gynecologic clinical trial, I don't know how you guys put up posters or recruitment flyers, Go and engage with it and make an informed decision. If that is something that you want to participate in, go for it. It's a free country, and if that is not what you want to do, make an informed decision not to participate, but at least be partaking in the process of clinical trials and development of this literature that is required for us to have a sample size that is bigger than one.
Especially since you're right across the street from one of the biggest centers in the world that do so many trials.
Please ask your question. Thank you. You've
First,
been so
I'll
patient.
say, being a victim of 23 fibroids removed, red meat was the only thing that worked. So that's when they found out I was anemic and they figured out what was going on. So I would just say that. Two quick questions. Number one, you've spoken heavily about fibroids being heavily in African American women. But do you know if it's hereditary? Is it hereditary to get fibroids? That's number one. And the second question is, so you talked about your product, but the research was in Vietnam, but did you have African Americans part of that study as well to see if it has the same impact?
There were no African American women in the study in Vietnam. The other studies that I sponsored were actually done at American managed sites in Mexico. So they were done on women of color, but we didn't have black women to participate in those studies.
We don't know.
Yes.
More research is needed.
Yes, agree. And the comparison that we give about black versus white is actually an American cohort of patients that we know of. And that's why we can't overgeneralize it. Any female in the reproductive age group between 70 to 80% of females in the reproductive age group by the time they turn 50 will have a diagnosis of some form of fibroids, and 50% of them are symptomatic. So it's actually a disease of all women of reproductive age group, but seen within our American cohort at a higher prevalence among black women.
And I think that goes back to the point about representation in clinical studies. So when we would get to the next phase of our studies, we would make sure to include proportionally.
Geographical representation of all population types in the U.S.
Perfect. And we see another question out there.
There's one there, I think. First of all, thank you for sharing your story in endometriosis. That's always hard. But my question is, you've clearly proven some sort of efficacy with the drug, and you're talking about funding and looking for funding to go into the next stages of clinical trials. And you guys have also talked about, okay, there is an increase in desire for these types of drugs in the market. What is the pushback that you receive most, so that if we go out into our communities, into our spaces, we can help answer that question if someone is unsure about it?
It's not ready for prime time yet. So what you saw, the data, is still preclinical. So there are different phases of drug development. In phase 1, it goes to people who are otherwise healthy. You're looking for safety and tolerability of the intervention that you are giving to the people. And then in phase 2 is typically where you're doing dose escalation and efficacy studies and side effect profiling in patients with that disease condition. So that is where we will get to know what dose works best for people. And that's still a small cohort of patients. And then there's phase 3, where you have now a determined dose, which is safe, likely efficacious, and then you take it to a larger sample size and have a good comparator and control. And then in a randomized control fashion, you can then make a decision whether that trend still holds or not.
And Big Pharma used to fund these early stage studies, but since about 2018, when they did a lot of investment and then COVID hit, they haven't had exits from their business investments in 2018 and 19. So Big Pharma in general has stopped funding early stages, and the NIH at this point is also not funding. So if we had full funding, the soonest this drug could come to market would be about 5 years, the soonest. We did have some good advancements because of COVID. Some things got fast-tracked, but without the funding, we're sitting here in a Ferrari with no gas in the engine.
I think it's the question over here.
Yeah, actually, this question's for you, Shelley.
first product.
Okay, the first product. Is there anything available where we can have estrogen delivered for menopausal women in the same way? So please tell everybody about Three Daughters and how that works, because it's fascinating. I wish they had that when I was younger.
So for those of you that don't know what Three Daughters is, it's a self-assembling IUD that has a magnetic core, and the first product is going to be coated in copper, which is what the Paragard or IUD has, and it would be for contraception. The real plan is to be drug delivery to the uterus so that we could put other API, active ingredients, on each. So it's 3 elliptical units, that's why it's called Three Daughters. And we could possibly put on different active ingredients on each of the ellipses in either a macro or micro particles in a control release and deliver hormones of different kinds. Real plan initially would be to put progesterone on there for the rest cycle for in vitro fertilization. But my biggest dream, because of my age, is to treat uterine cancer. But yeah, all of it's possible. We just don't know yet.
So you had asked specifically about estrogen drug delivery. One of the things that is available that you may be familiar with is the Mirena IUD, which is progesterone. And one of the things that's being used occasionally, again, I'm not advocating for it or off-label use, but for women who get an IUD that's hormonal in the perimenopause phase, they can often go without having to take the oral progesterone to counteract their estrogen. So instead of having something like an estrogen patch and a progesterone pill, if your IUD is still recent, that's something that some physicians are trying. So we know that drug delivery works. It's just a matter of which drug.
Oh, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your wonderful insights. I was curious about, I think we talk a lot about diversifying clinical trials, but I was thinking before we even get to the clinic, can we start earlier in preclinical models? I mean, I think we talked about how under the microscope and maybe even to a cellular level, there might be some differences. Can we start early with preclinical models, looking at particular types of cells, before we even get to a point where we're looking at full humans? Is there space for that? Because I know a lot of, for example, cancer cells sometimes come from white women or Japanese women, but I don't know if there are, besides, of course, like HeLa cells, that specifically we can use in starting us up before we get where we need to go.
Again, very lovely question and something that we think about all the time. We can do primary cell lines from tissue that we collect at surgery, and then we are in we have developed fibroids or fibroid organoids. So they are small little. They have an inner cell mass and then outer cell mass, and then there's extracellular matrix of collagen. So they essentially very much look like a fibroid. So there's a likelihood that with the use of those organoids, some of these testings can be done at a faster pace.
Yeah, it's some amazing work actually going on right here in Massachusetts in that area, in several areas. But you guys are doing that also at Hopkins.
At MIT too, I should say,
No,
because we do collaborate. Yes, yes, and Boston University, MIT, at Oxford, yes, a lot of places, which I do believe will change the way we do some of the preclinical work and expedite it. I'm cautiously optimistic.
Oh, Erin, you're next.
Hi. Thank you for this wonderful conversation this evening. So my question, when providing health care for a woman who comes into a doctor's office and understanding their specific healthcare history, as a whole as a patient to provide that care, it's very clear after conversations here today that there are major gaps in research and bedside patient care for women. How can the new technologies like wearable devices, AI, and machine learning bridge these gaps in care and support doctors and nurses? And what do you foresee as some of the risks to the implementation of these technologies in patient care?
I want to talk about the risks first. Over-information
Negative Nelly.
is bothering me.
Over what?
too much information is stressing out the patient.
Yes, but I think what we're talking about is efficiency, right?
Oh, okay.
So yes, be self-educated, know your body, keep your health records. Between AI and technology, huge application in healthcare. We talked about one just the other day where there's a vision for almost like a health card, where you would have all your electronic data on a card, so that shortens the conversation with the physician or maximizes that time because you're actually using it for a conversation. They would already have the data before you walk in the room. And rather than our current scenario, which I think we all experience, when you're trying to have a conversation with the doctor in that limited time, they're typing away on their EHR system. And it's not even about a normal flow of conversation. It's just they need to get their questions answered and check, check, check. And I don't know about you guys, but by the time they ask me these questions, I'm like, why am I even here? I don't even know what I came for. So it gets you going down a completely different road versus having them well prepped for the conversation. And so many applications for each of us as individuals in our health and wellness, not just the wearable trackers and everything else. But we met a really cool young woman today who's utilizing AI specifically for women and women's needs. And she's in her early stages. But I think there's a lot of hope there. And I'm more optimistic about AI than less. I know it's fraught with its challenges. I've heard some recent stories about lawyers trying to use it in the courtroom, and it was making up fake case law. I mean, that is just insane. But I think as long as we use it responsibly, like anything else, it's really going to help. The one area, though, I did read a recent Forbes article that talked about the fact that because women's health is so light on data collection over the last decades, it's kind of like garbage in, garbage out. We don't want to fill those holes in data with assumptions. And that's where it can hurt us. And that's where some of these companies, like Emma, I think they're out of the UK, they're trying to address data with a women-centric lens, understanding that women use different language to describe symptoms than men do, understanding that women often downplay or ignore their symptoms. So I think as long as we apply the right lens and we're cautious, we should really be much more efficient in the future, not only with that data collection, but executing on it.
I know my friend Megan, who is a physician, wants to ask a question, so I can't wait to hear what it is.
Oh, no, it's nothing exciting. It was just a comment. But I agree with the garbage in, garbage out. I think that's
Yeah.
really important for AI and how
We can't hear.
Oh, yeah. So I was just making a comment. I just looked for fibroids, so we've kind of passed that, on clinicaltrials.gov, and there's very few research studies, clinical trials for people to engage in. There was 0 listed in Boston recruiting, and only 19 across the country, and a number of those are on pain. So anyway, I just would urge everyone to check back there with whatever condition you have. It's clinical trials, government. All studies are meant to be there so that you can engage in and enroll or family members or whoever's looking. And it's also another way actually to get good care and get workups, because usually their protocols involve inclusion-exclusion criteria, which means you have to have a scan and you have to have this, that, and the other. So it's a really good place to go. So thank you.
Megan,
So
I actually thought you were
Chitra
going to
had-
talk about something even more important, is the treatment for your son with the access to these kinds of natural products from plants.
And Buchitra has told me that if we can get funded and launch our clinical trials at Johns Hopkins, he can do the recruitment in a day. There are so many women
That is
that
just a
need.
lie. I have not said that.
No, Carol said she could do it.
But there is no shortage of women that need, that are they're willing to participate in clinical trials for fibroids.
Yes, and a point that I did want to make about that is inclusion is an important thing in clinical trials, but it should not come at the cost of impact on reproductive potential or any other health-related potential for a human being. So when we do, one of the major reasons why women were not included in earlier clinical trials were because they were so concerned about the reproductive potential of female. But we now have the ways, and we I would purport we had ways then as well, to monitor and evaluate hormonal levels, impact on the fertility of an individual if that was of concern. So it may cost a little bit more to ensure that there is protection to all bodily symptoms, but inclusion should not come at the cost of not evaluating all bodily symptoms and findings. So that I think, has always been a concern. And I think that is why the estrogenicity of Krilla was so important.
Yes.
Because we didn't want, nobody wants to, hopefully nobody wants to purposefully do bad things to anyone else, right? So you want to have an investigational drug where you have the safety profile that is almost known before it is given to a human being. And that is the utility of a phase 0 study, and that can be done through your organoids, and that can be very helpful.
There's a new research tool I learned about recently at, of all places, the National Center for Natural Products Research is at Ole Miss, Oxford, Mississippi. And they have a botanical drug conference that's a collaboration with the FDA every year. And it's April every year. I learned about something called C. elegans, which are a little microscopic worm that don't have pain sensors. And they don't have many of the organs in the human body, but some of their functions replicate the action of the organ in the body. So as the FDA says they're looking for ways to move away from animal studies, C. elegans are something that I'm going to be watching in the future.
Hi. Thank you all. Hi. Thank you all so much for sharing. I just had a question, a pretty general question for anyone to answer. How do you best engage with your stakeholders when you're developing your research or your product? Especially given, since you're in your phase 2 trials, I was curious, like, how do you, in your experience, engage with your stakeholders?
Okay, first, identify all the stakeholders, because so many times we are limited by what we know. So if we think that a study, let's say we're evaluating fetal therapy, and the stakeholder, which is quite easily in front of you, is the mother, maybe also engage the partner, and maybe also engage the anesthesiologist, what they will need, maybe also engage with the neonatal ICU in terms of what you need, an ethics committee in terms of the interventions you're developing. All of those things, if done in a timely fashion, will reduce the cognitive burden you'll have when you're going through. First of all, you can't do that study in today's world without an IRB approval. So these are all things which are, luckily for all of us, in place. You have to have your protocol review. You need to have an ethical review of for high-risk studies. So sit down, look around the proposed research question, identify the direct, indirect recipients of the intervention, and then initiate with simple, open-ended questions. And ask them, who do you believe will be impacted by this intervention? And the reason why this came so quickly to me was I was recently sitting on an ethics review panel for a fetal therapy. This is a phase 2 of the first widely publicized study from Hopkins, which I'm not going to say name of. And the point of a stakeholder analysis is we were able to identify an externally validated cohort for them. So whatever results comes out in the phase 2 will be even better quality than what we have from phase 1. And that's why stakeholder analysis is important as soon as possible. Yeah.
Hi. So this has been really interesting. And as I've been listening, I can't help think, but like, I have 2 degrees. I'm very fortunate with what I've been able to have access to, yet I'm still learning so much from the short amount of things that we've covered. So I'm curious, from the marketing perspective, from the education perspective, what is being done out there, I guess, to engage women about their own health, and not only women, but also men to, I guess it would eventually go up to those stakeholder pieces, but just the education piece I'm really curious about.
Yeah, so I think to oversimplify it, it starts with the awareness, right? And there's a lot of different vehicles for that. One of the things that was really important for me when I was leading our IUD franchise at Bayer was making sure that we go to women where they are. And a lot of that is engaging in social media. And knowing, recognizing they're going to see videos on TikTok talking about their IUD insertion being the most painful thing they ever experienced in their life. Well, you can't just expect their doctor to have that conversation with them. You have to be there with information and help them have a better conversation with their doctor, whether it's pain prevention or something else. But I also think it starts in schools. And I'd love for Sue to talk a little bit more about this. One of our colleagues, Carol Johnson, that she keeps mentioning from Uterine Kind, because of this issue with women understanding a frog's anatomy better than their own, and because of the many challenges we face as women throughout our lifespan, from our first period through menopause and beyond, really making sure that girls have a good foundation, and girls are able to feel comfortable saying the word vagina and explaining what's happening with their body and not associate that with shame. So I think that's really the first step. But we have education to do, I think, in multiple areas. We have education to do with investors. We have education to do when it comes to improving our trials. We have there's a lot of opportunities to improve awareness around women's health. And one of the things we were talking about today at this conference is getting groups together like ours, very cross-functional. I mean, look at this crew right here. And figuring out ways that we can really partner together across the women's health ecosystem to bridge some of those gaps. But I think a lot of it starts with ourselves, right? And this is a great crew here. You can tell by how engaged you are, starting in your own community and having those open conversations about your struggles. Because what I find, whether it's my autoimmune, whether it's my endometriosis, my infertility battle, I share these things because I think it helps normalize it for others. And I think it helps them realize that they are not alone. And I think being able to have more candid conversations like this opens the door for that. So that would be my take, but I want to hear from my pals over here.
Well, I'm fond of saying that although men don't manifest menopause or uterine fibroids, doesn't mean that they don't suffer from those conditions. And you have to make it, we can't do this battle, we can't solve these problems without men. And we make it personal. Men need to understand that these conditions that are impacting their wives, mothers, aunts, daughters, and that's how it's impacting them. And when women are taken out of the workforce because of these conditions, or taken out of the caregiving roles because more women are suffering from dementia, and maybe if that's caused by hysterectomies, you know, it places that societal burden on all of us. And so men seem to be controlling most of the venture capital checks that are being written still. We have to raise the awareness and make the case that men are impacted by poor women's health.
From where I yes, men are impacted.
And that's
I
probably
agree.
why you got into this, because of your own relationship with probably your mother or your sister.
Okay, have you listened to my podcast? Because literally, I had a aha moment on a podcast, and I wasn't even thinking about it. And it was with Tanika Gray-Wabran. She is the founder and CEO of the White Dress Project, and it creates awareness about uterine fibroids. And what sparked her journey was the fact that she opened her closet and she couldn't find anything white, because she was always so anxious and depressed because of the fact she could bleed any point of time. And then we were ruminating on what led me to researching about period poverty in the United States and all the things that I do. And It was a very simple interaction. I was maybe in 5th grade, and a girl had her period in class. And everybody thought she was dying, including the girl. And I was like, no. And I have 2 older sisters, and my mother taught me about sexual and reproductive health. And I was like, no, she's just having her period. She's fine. She'll be fine. And then at the next PTA, of course, my mother was there, and then the teacher's like, how does your boy know, blah, blah, blah. And my mother's like, because I told him. And I think you should teach this to everybody. And I was like, yeah, there's... And then I cried for a little bit, then we didn't record that part. And it was, I think it's our lived experiences, and they have a lot of power. And any time when you, and I have done this, and I'm a physician, and when I go to see my doctor, I sometimes feel, I know what's wrong with me. I can read my own symptoms, right? I'm going for some kind of validation from a person who has this knowledge gap, well, practicing it every day versus somebody not practicing it every day. You live with your body every single day. You know what your symptoms are and what is the delta. Is this normal for you? Is this not normal for you? Do not let somebody push you around by saying that the lived experience you are having is not valid. Amen. I've had to say that to my urologist. And I was like, no, no, you just told me a lot of things. Give me 2 minutes to process this before I make up my mind.
Good for you.
And you can do that too. You have the power to talk to your physicians. They're your equal partner in that care. Have that conversation. Write down what you want to talk about, though, because definitely forget your symptoms when you're sitting in an office.
Yourself. You need your own advocate, too.
Yes. So be your own advocate and never feel less than, because these are symptoms. Almost 1 in 5 women have fibroids. So there's a high likelihood that 1 in 5 women is experiencing one of those symptoms at some point of life. So talk about periods. It's not a taboo topic. Just talk about what you're experiencing, and maybe you'll find a friend to talk about, and then feel empowered enough to go and make that appointment, and then empowered enough to talk about your symptoms at that appointment, and eventually get the care that you need.
There are dozens, if not hundreds, of fibroids in this room.
We don't want to scare you. Just get an ultrasound.
So let me just say it a little bit more gentler. Every one of you, man and woman, need a primary care, but you also need, if a female, to see your gynecologist at least every year. And one of the other things that we haven't talked about is cardiovascular disease is going to affect all of you women differently. And I'm an example of what they sort of call a silent heart attack that I had years ago several times. It presented as severe abdominal pain. And if I hadn't jokingly had a conversation with my primary care this past April, that I'm not on any prescription medication. And she said, I can't believe you're like the only patient over 65, and I'm much more than that, is not on a prescription. Is there anything we're missing in your history? I said, not that I can think of, but I do worry about cardiovascular disease, because every time I am at a women's health conference, we talk about these abnormal conditions that present differently. I scheduled with a cardiologist. He did an EKG. He did the full panorama of biomarkers that are not done routinely. He demanded to see my earlier EKGs. They missed reading them accurately because they don't see it the same way as the traditional. I had had several. Luckily, I'm an athlete. Luckily, even though my echo was very abnormal, my stress test, because I stayed healthy and active, was normal. But please, especially women postmenopausal, encourage your moms. Just like you're having a mammogram on a regular basis, you're checking your colon on a regular basis, make sure you see a cardiologist on a regular basis.
Yes.
I am extremely impressed by the great breakthroughs that have been made recently in women's health. I am concerned, however, about the funding for the to keep the incredible research going, and also to encourage innovators to bring new products to market, or to even get the funding to get to a stage of feasibility studies and clinical trials. How do you see, given the circumstances, to make sure that the funding continues for both the research and also for bringing those products to market?
So since I've been in the raising mode like Sue has, one of the things I'm noticing, and I do want to thank the Gates Foundation, and to say this in a polite way, Bill and Melinda separating. Melinda has now got her own fund going, and that people like the Williams sisters have funds going, and there's a lot of philanthropy moving. I think we have a tailwind going on in that area of family offices, as we'd like to call them, coming up with alternative funding, and so that is happening. And I will tell you, despite what you may be thinking and what we're feeling, I think the pharma company venture arms are starting to look at this space because they're realizing this 51% is much more lucrative than they realized, and they can make their home run. And when pharma's looking at it, the venture world will start looking at it, and they are.
And there are women's angel investment groups that you can join for where you don't have to be writing $1 million check. You can write much smaller checks, and then they vet the companies and help make those investments. So the things like Golden Seeds, and they're around. You can find those. And please write a check. It's like PBS. The private sector is going to have to step up.
And they are, and you can.
I'd like to continue this theme a bit, and especially going back to a few comments that you made, Sue, about how most VCs are men. That's true. There are women who are VCs, though. They also don't invest in women entrepreneurs or in women's health.
Not enough.
So, I mean, Shelley's made some interesting points about the tide beginning to change, but how can all of us help to change this nonsense of investors refusing to invest in half the population?
That's the question.
And I do think it starts with normalizing a lot of these conversations, because in my mind, the fact that we even have a women's health, it's health, right? Just like we now recognize mental health, it's health. The other thing I think we need to do a better job of with investors, right? Know your audience. Again, we're here because we're passionate about this space. When you're talking to an investor, it's not because it's the right thing to do. It's being crystal clear of the financial opportunity. And I think in the early stages of women's health, correct me if I'm wrong, Shelley, I think we did a disservice to ourselves by really talking to ourselves and playing on the heartstrings. That doesn't work for investors. So I think we need to get our economic stories down a little tighter. But I do think, to your point about some positivity, not only do we see the $2.5 billion from Gates that's earmarked specifically for women's health, Melinda's stepping up. What was the other fund I was going to refer to? Say? Yes, is another one. I'm also even hearing from...
There's a couple other family offices that I've recently come across, and my brain is kind of fried, so they're not coming up. But there is a lot in that area happening.
The other positive thing that I'm hearing is private equity firms that have life science verticals, right? So they typically have trying to think of the last one that I talked to. They have a life science vertical, and then they have a consumer health vertical. And they're starting to realize that there's real money in women's health. And it was the McKinsey report that I was going to quote. McKinsey report came out January of 2024, and it highlighted not just the gaps in women's health, but the economic potential of addressing them. And I think that's what's gotten investors to stand up and take notice. And I've had a couple calls with PE firms that are trying to figure out how to create a separate women's healthcare vertical, because they're realizing it's not just a consumer thing. We need providers involved, and that there's a real money-making opportunity there.
And you've reminded me about the WHAM report, WHAM. Women's Health Access Matters is a group, the Magic Carolee Lee, who commissioned RAND to write a report on women's health that will give you both economic arguments about why investing in women founders and women-led companies pay off better, and also the health disparities in the non-bikini medicine, the heart disease. And women are more likely to die of a heart attack the first time because it's not diagnosed. But the WHAM report, again, you can look it up, but highly encourage you to read that. And some of the coaching that I've been getting lately is to say, you have to play on the playing field where you're at. That means you have to behave like a white male Stanford graduate pitching AI in Silicon Valley who can go and get $30 million for something scribbled on a cocktail napkin. So we have to stop pitching, invest in my company because it's good for women, it's going to make them feel better. No, I'm going to give you a 10 to 12x return in 3 to 5 years. That's the bottom line. It's the money.
So let me
if we
take that
can
a step
prove
further.
the money, go.
So there's a company in Concord called Comanche, which is working on preeclampsia, which is something we haven't talked about, which is a life-threatening condition that happens during pregnancy or even during labor. And if not only could kill the mom, it can kill the fetus, and it can be harmful to the baby. So this company has had an oversubscribed B round, and they're in phase 2. And I was introduced to the CEO, who's a male, who had already had a home run with another company. And I said to him, when I sent my 3 daughters' information to him, what do you think about my one-pager and my pitch in my investment deck? And he said, Shelley, as long as you want to call yourself a women's health company, you're going to go on deaf ears with the VCs. I said, you have Allison, oh my God, I draw a blank. She's an Olympian who almost died with both pregnancies from preeclampsia. You're a women's health company. No, I'm a cardiovascular company that is addressing a life-threatening condition that impacts pregnant women and their fetuses and newborns. And as long as you want to call yourself a women's health company, you're going on deaf ears. I know that's wrong, but it's sort of like what Sue is saying. First of all, you have to know who you're talking to and give them the words they want to hear, so at least you can tell them the financial impact it's going to be on their wallet. And they seem to love the word, life-threatening. And in all honesty, what you heard about fibroids and endometriosis, these feel life-threatening to those patients, and they could be if they're not taken care of.
I think we're at time. Lori, thank you.
Thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. I think we would all agree this is very enlightening. You'll be around for a little bit if anyone has any additional questions, so feel free to speak with them outside. But thank you all for being here today. Tomorrow you will be getting a survey from us, so we would welcome any feedback that you had about this program, as well as anything as alums that or students that you would like to see more of. We would love to hear it. So again, thank you for being here, and have a great night.